Now we're going to talk about servicing the front differential drive shaft for the 2004 Nissan Frontier. And what we want to do is, first we want to make sure we apply the emergency brake. Then we just want to make sure the transmission is in park, and we will shift the 4x4 lever into 4x4 high. What this is going to do, it's going to lock the front axle drive shaft, which will increase the force and leverage required to turn the drive shaft. The reason we are inspecting this drive shaft and performing a service is because we must check the U-joints on the rear and the front. Now between the front and the rear U-joint, we will notice a slip yoke. This is a spline slide into the front yoke. So we want to check for movement in this slip joint. We will experience movement on this slip joint when the vehicle is in operation, because the front axle, that will be the front differential, will have a tendency to move back and forth during four-wheel drive operation. So we do not want the drive shaft to be pulling on the yoke, because this will cause damage to the pinion seal and affect the pinion bearing. This also goes the same for the transfer case, because if the drive shaft slip yoke is to become stuck when the vehicle is in operation, any movement between the front differential and the transfer case will be transferred through this shaft. And if this slip does not account for the movement of the front differential from the transfer case, it will affect the seal and the bearing bushing inside the transfer case. So we must now remove the drive shaft from the transfer case yoke and the front differential yoke for inspection on the slip joint. In this slip joint is a spline, and we want to make sure we grease this spline. Water will have a tendency to seep past this seal and enter into the slip spline. This water will cause a corrosion, and eventually you will start getting a lash on the spline inside this slip yoke. So let's proceed to removing the drive shaft U-joint from its yoke on both ends of the shaft. Let's start by removing the drive shaft from the transfer case side. And what we want to do is we want to make sure we spray it down with some of this penetrating oil on all the nuts and bolts. Now if you need to turn the drive shaft, you're simply going to slip the transfer case 4x4 lever. Let's move to the front. We have already sprayed these bolts down a few hours ago so they could soak into the threads, which will ease unscrewing the nut and separating the part. We also want to spray some oil or penetrating oil in this area, so this will soak into the slip joint while we're removing the part. I'm going to use this 14mm combination wrench and this 13mm combination wrench, but you don't have to hold the bolt when you're turning the nut in this application. When we look closely, we can see the bolt head is actually machined to fix to the post of the yoke U-joint support. So what we'll do is we're just going to take a 13mm, we're going to put it on here, and I saw this cool trick on YouTube on a video. You could go look at the video too. And this is gonna just get removed by your fingers. You're gonna have to try to wrench a couple more times. Can't really get a socket in here. You have to use a combination wrench. And that's the nut. Make sure you place it in the right position. Don't use this side when you replace it. You're going to use the flare end. Now to get this bolt from out of here, we have to put back on this nut. Now we're just going to place our wrench on here. And give it a tap like that. And that will bring our nut and bolt together. Make sure you replace the nut on the bolt, because most of the time you're going to have this on the ground and you don't want to get the threads damaged. So when you're going to get ready to work on this inner bolt right here, you could always disconnect the 4x4 lever from the passenger compartment and make your shift from high and low at this linkage to rotate the front drive shaft. You must also make sure that you have the wheel block with a wheel chock. On the inside of this stud is another bolt that you can grab with a wrench so this nut does not slip on you. So when you're going to be disconnecting this linkage, just make sure that the wheels are chock or prevented from rolling. You should also make sure that you're not doing this kind of work on a uneven surface. We will use some form of effort and force to pull this leverage down, and this will release our shaft so we can rotate it for removal. But what we're going to do is we're going to lock it in this position right now. I'm going to move to the front of the drive shaft, because you don't want to disconnect this part, because then you're not going to have the ease of rotating the shaft for the front removal. So the penetrating oil is really helping us out here. Without it, you're going to run into a lot of problems of stripping the bolts. Well, I must say I'm getting lucky under here because the vehicle is high enough already, so I don't really need to support it on a jack stand. But that's the benefit of owning a 4x4, is that it's truly elevated off the ground to allow workmanship under the vehicle. So this one was easy. Didn't have to bang it with a wrench. Now, it's not a good idea to be working on the suspension or underneath the vehicle with your bare hands, because you never know where the vehicle went and you never know what happened under here sanitation wise. So it's best to always use a glove on your hand when working on suspension and below the vehicle. Also, do not forget to wear your eye goggles and some form of breathing apparatus. So let's go to the back. So sometimes this leverage here is going to be very hard to move by hand if you try to go like this. So what I've done is, you might want to take a vice grip, but I've been investing in this tool in a while. So I'm just going to clip it on here. This way it will allow me to rotate the drive shaft. Now we could go back to the front end and remove the remaining two bolts. So we're going to lock that again. It is very important that you chock the front wheel in the front and the rear when you're removing the drive shaft, because you cannot truly rely on the 4x4 lever So you can see the drive shaft has some twisting moving to it, and that's because it's engaging with the front differential and trying to make the vehicle move. But since we have the wheel chock, it's able to hold the drive shaft, so we could untighten the bolts and nut. So let's move to the other side. Well, this is the last nut and bolt for the front differential side of the drive shaft. So this was another easy one for us. So when you finally remove all the bolts from the front of the drive shaft, this is what you're going to encounter. Just going to be able to turn the drive shaft no matter where you shift this lever. Messing with this lever can be very troublesome. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to rotate the front drive shaft, which is already disconnected from the front differential. So we want to rotate the shaft to get the bolt down here. And we're trying to mess with this leverage here. So we basically can't get any more movement out of the drive shaft than we have here. So let's change our position and attack the bolt from the other corner. Well, sometime you're truly can't rely on this lever when you're under the vehicle and the vehicle is on the ground. So it'll be best to leave this linkage connected and apply your movement from inside the vehicle. But since we're out here and we have two more bolts to remove, we're going to try and get this one off, and then we're going to rotate the shaft for the next one. The wheel chuck in front of the tire, the front tire, to remove this side of the bolt. So you see what we're experiencing is the head of the bolt is becoming stripped. So we're going to have to hold this with another piece of tool, preferably a 14mm wrench. Yep. So this sucker here is stripped. It can't hold its position. Now it's going to be important that we rotate this drive shaft so the two bolts and nut could be at the bottom, because I have to hold this nut with a vice grip. So we are now going to go back to reconnecting our shifter linkage. So it's not necessary to disconnect this linkage. I just did it because I figure it'd be easier to turn the drive shaft from under here. We must now realign this shifter linkage. You see this nut right here? You have to make sure it's square because it have to slide into the slot. We're going to start this by hand. Make sure you catch it all the way up to the linkage. So it's important that this part here is fixed. So this nut will get torqued to around 20 foot-pounds. So since I have connected this shifter lever, the drive shaft is now easy to turn. So this is going to take some playing with when you're going to be taking off, when you're going to be removing the nut, because this really takes a lot of effort to shift by hand, as I found out. you don't have to find out the same way. Just shift the leverage from inside the vehicle, and you're going to have to play with it to get the optimum position for the nuts and the bolt. So we have connected the shifter in the 2 low position. It's now in 4 high. And we want to check. Okay, so we have some restraint on the shaft. So this is another different nut we're trying than the one we stripped before. So with the emergency brake engaged, the vehicle should not move. But since I need to adjust the rear brake on this vehicle, we're not achieving full emergency brake application. But once you have the wheel chock or block, you don't have to worry about the vehicle rolling away and you being under it. So it's important that we replace these nuts on the bolt. You see how much time it takes? But just imagine when you destroy the thread, how much time it's going to take then. So now I'm going to take my favorite tool. This is a vice grip. I just want to grab this bolt. And that should be good right there. I want to lock it. With one hand on the vice grip and you in the way, I'm going to place the wrench on here. Actually, I want to place it this way so I can have some leverage. And I'm going to hold the vice grip and just crack that sucker. So this is not an easy service right here. This is something you're probably going to want to give to your local mechanic because he has a shoplift. I really don't recommend that you be laying on the ground as a novice working on suspension, because this is where you can get hurt. If you don't know what you're doing. But it's always best to apply the emergency brakes and make sure you have some wheel chocks for the wheel. So I just want to replace this nut on this bolt. This is a fine thread bolt. This is a metric. Now let's get ready to pull the drive shaft out of place. Since we have to use a pry bar on the 2 ends to collapse the drive shaft to get it out of position, and we're unable to do this by hand, it's a sign that the slip joint is having seizure or rust or restriction is preventing us from pulling the joint back. So we're going to use this pry bar. We're going to try to fix it into this end right here. I simply just want to pry this back so we can clear it off. Since I'm under here, I want to place my catch can under the vehicle and just spray down underneath the engine, because this is where we had an oil leak from the valve cover. So I want to degrease all this oil, because you don't want the oil to get onto the rubber mount, bushing and support. The oil will most likely degrade the oil and cause more problem along the drive line. So it's important that we clean up under here since we're down here. So on this left hand side here is the catalytic converter. This is the differential, and up in there is our crank position sensor. You're going to need to remove this front drive shaft to gain access to the crankshaft position sensor, which is bolted onto the transmission bell housing. Once you're complete with spraying down your detergent, you're going to fill the same bottle with water and simply spray down all the area that you degrease. It's important that you degrease. You see right here on the front differential, you have a rubber mount that supports the differential to the cross member. Well, you don't want oil to saturate these rubber mount, because it's going to cause deflection on the drive line for the front wheel drive. So we want to make sure we degrease all these rubber bushings. Even up here, you're going to find the motor mount that sits under the valve cover. And oil from the valve cover is simply just going to cause the motor mount to become broken. It's very important that you remove or wash the degreaser away, because if you leave the degreaser itself can react with the rubber and degenerate performance. So now we want to inspect the front drive shaft, and what we want to look at is the U-joint. Make sure we have no movement or play in the U-joint. This U-joint is dried up and there's no grease inside, and it's very brittle in movement. We also want to inspect the other side. It's very freely, very loose. So we're going to replace these two U-joints. We also want to inspect our slip-yoke. We have a fitting here for a grease fitting, but what we want to do is we want to make sure we could pull this up. And since we can't pull it, there is no movement in the slip-yoke. This will affect the seal and the bearing inside the front differential and the transmission 4x4 transfer case. So here we have the inner slip yoke, which is a spline on the end inside this outer slip yoke. This is our flange, U-joints, weights for balancing the rotation of the shaft itself. So we are now going to try to remove this little grease nipple and install our grease nipple to grease the slip joint. If we cannot grease the slip joint and we do not get any movement in slippage back and forth, then we're going to have to take this outer yoke apart from the inner yoke and inspect what's causing it for it to be frozen inside the spline. Most of the time, corrosion is a big contributor to this non-movement. So when you look at the shaft, how the shaft was mounted, it was mounted like this. Actually, it was mounted like this. And what we really want is when the vehicle is driving forward, as the water gets up on the shaft, it will ride its way off the shaft. If it was to go like this, all the water will end up going into that seal crevices and basically making this become frozen. So let's go ahead and take this baby apart and see what's wrong with it.